Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Dan Nessel Show. I'm your host, Dan Nessel, and today we're talking content. And I can think of no one better than Gay Flashman, the CEO of Formative Content and the author of Powerful B2B Content, to have this conversation with. Now, I hope you're ready for a deep discussion about content strategy and content creation and how companies should be thinking about their content in the context of the world we live in today. Because as an ex-journalist and TV producer, now an entrepreneur and a thought leader in her own right, Gay really brings a unique and thoughtful and passionate perspective to content strategy and creation. So let's just jump right into it. I am here with Gay Flashman. I cannot believe it. It's been a long time in the making. How are you, Gay?
Good, very good. Thank you. Here in kind of an autumnal evening in the UK.
Yeah, we're on opposite ends of the Atlantic here. Mm-hmm. And I'm doing a rare mid-afternoon podcast from my side and an early evening, I suppose, from Gay's side, which is weird because usually when I do these things, I'm looking out at the dark and I feel kind of secure in my cave. But right now I'm looking out at a beautiful September afternoon here in New Jersey in rural New Jersey, almost rural New Jersey, lots of trees. There might be a deer walking by. I mean, it'll be a nice change. Forgive me if I get a little distracted by the beautiful almost changing foliage. But it's a kind of new thing for me, but I'm really excited about this because this has been in the making now for quite a while. And we've been through a couple of postponements and I'm glad to finally have Gay on the line, so to speak, here on the metaphorical line here, because, last time we tried, I had thunderstorms, right? And, podcasting is a cottage industry. So when the thunder's out there, I can't record that. I don't have any soundproofing on the windows,
I love the fact that it couldn't go ahead. It was that bad because we had an earthquake today in the UK.
You're kidding.
No, it was like enough to kind of one chair and one dustbin fell over and it was a major news event.
And you're still on with me. That's a miracle.
Absolutely. I can work through a crisis, Dan.
Of course you can, which is one of the reasons why we work with you. But the other time I was worried about my dogs because my dogs barking also are problematic for this great art form of podcasting. But I recently bought a collar that squirts a cloud of citronella, like citrus flavored, citrus smelling, harmless stuff for the dog. And you will probably not hear her. It is amazing. It is.
I thought you were going to say it gave electric shocks.
No, we won't do that. We are not for cruelty to animals on this podcast or in my family.
I know. I was thinking, what is he going to say?
No. But this is it's really great. It scared the bejesus out of her for a little while, but she seems to be in the non-barking mode for a while. So I'll take that as a sign that I can do these midday podcasts now whenever I have the ability.
You need to send me one of those collars over, Dan, for mine. But mine were barking at 4 a.m. At a squirrel, probably.
It's as it happens, it happens. But anyway, all that as a long preamble to say that I'm really happy to be here with Gay. And we've known each other for about 3 years, right? Mm-hmm. And full disclosure, Gay and her firm, Formative Content, work very closely with us in my day job. And we've been working together on content strategy and content marketing, mostly on content production and creation for the last several years through Gay's firm. In the last year, Gay has put out a incredible book called Powerful B2B Content, and I think that the title says it all. It is geared toward people who really are building a content strategy, who are building a content engine, as it were. And having just been through that in our company, I found it to be quite poignant, pertinent, timely, and certainly like a lot of it was so familiar because I've been talking to you for 3 years. I'm like, okay, yeah, I hear Gay's voice in this and I see exactly what you're saying.
Yeah.
But I think we'll get to that because it's a tremendous book, and anybody who is really in the content marketing field or really more, and we'll get to this, storytelling and brand journalism, which is the way that Gay kind of refers to it. I think that it's a great reference point for people. So I'd like you to meet the author, Miss Gay Flashman. Gay, can you tell us a little about yourself? How you doing? What's going on?
Well, thank you so much for that kind introduction. The book, it was published in January. It's a few months on now. It feels like a long time ago. The world has turned a lot since it was published. I am, as I said, based in the UK, and I started life as a journalist. When I was much, much younger, I wanted to be a journalist right from the age of about 15, 16, got a holiday job in the local newspaper, worked for the university newspaper when I was at uni, and then got a cub reporter's job when I left university at a beautiful newspaper called the Evening Argus in Brighton on the coast here in the UK. And I was a cub reporter for a couple of years, finding stories, uncovering stories, interviewing people, really doing what I love to do, which was I had pledged that I wanted to be a journalist. I wanted to hear people's stories. And I was really interested in that time in feature stories, but I was very much wedded to the newspaper. And it was that long ago that when I first arrived in the newspaper, in the newsroom, people were actually typing on typewriters and smoking. So that shows you just how old I am, Dan.
Wasn't that long ago. I remember that time.
And so that was the start of my career. And then I moved pretty quickly to the BBC as a trainee, a news trainee. And I shifted from what was called from newspaper journalism, basically print journalism, to what was at that time, again, just shows you what kind of a time it was to buy media journalism. So it was just radio and TV. And at the time that was seen as very innovative, that people who were that some of the journalists that were working on television were working also on radio. So I was taught how to read for radio, write for radio, gather radio stories, edit radio stories with a razor blade and tape, if you can imagine it. Probably my children would feel that was just absolutely out of the arc. But at the time, you used to stick pieces of tape together, which I can hardly believe I'm saying, but was the way that you made a radio bulletin.
I wish that young associates would do the same thing today. I think it's a character builder for sure. I was talking with a good friend of mine on a very recent, interview who I published last week, Tom Boatman, who also got his start in radio. You just reminded me of this and how, maybe we'll get back to this later, but the idea of writing for radio, he was on the ad side. So it's more like, how do you tell a story on behalf of a client in 15 to 20 seconds? Radio is really compacted.
Yep.
And to get in the ear of a listener, we have a big luxury here in podcasting where we can just go as long as we want. But I'm sorry to interrupt. I mean, radio is such a fascinating. I think it's almost like a crucible for learning how to do storytelling. It seems to me.
I think so, and it's a beautiful, intimate medium. That's what's lovely about radio and voice, however it's distributed. It's quite intense. It's very personal. You're very connected with the stories that you're listening to, and that's what I loved about radio. And also, I loved. At the time, for me, it was, again, talking to people, which is definitely a theme here, but also story gathering. So going out and finding the stories and reporting in a way that I think is quite unusual. You have a lot of kids now and a lot of people who are story gatherers or curators of other people's news. But I think what we're seeing, and we're certainly seeing that in the US, and I'm certainly seeing it in the UK as well. I know it's happening in the US, which is a kind of demise of local journalism and local papers. And very often, it's where it's where journalists learn their craft and storytellers learn their craft. But also, it's really important for democracy to be telling the stories that are happening, down your street. And I think, unfortunately, the business models for those local papers, local TV stations are struggling and they're suffering at the moment. And I think it remains to be seen, as they say, how that will eventuate and how things will move on and whether those papers will survive. And I hope that we find new business models, whether they be philanthropic or however they work out, that can support local papers. Because it was a great starting point. It was absolutely fantastic. I learnt my trade there.
And I'll tell you, we still read our local paper. It comes, we almost take it for granted, but I've noticed, of course, because I'm in the industry, that, the number of people who are writing for the local papers has changed, and you often see one name writing every single article in the paper, and it's very community-based and very local, but it's critically important. I think it is an important point, of course, for everything relating to, democracy, certainly for whatever is the news of import to your local community. But I feel like social media has really supplanted that in such a harmful way. I do think that what you see is these kind of groups that pop up for localities on Facebook or on other platforms where folks kind of get out whatever is bothering them, and there's no journalists there. There's no journalism there. It's pure opinion and it's pure anger and emotion and whatever else is kind of contrary to facts and reporting, and that's a terrible thing. I do hope that there is a renaissance or resurgence in the local paper and the local news, and whatever that looks like.
I think I think there has to be a balance. I think it's all about balance. And I think with the emergence of social media, what we've seen is the extreme. We've seen extremes of emotion. We've seen a lack of regulation. And I think there will need to be at some point some governance. I don't know what that looks like, but there does need to be a balance there. Yeah. And given that most of our kids now will be finding their news through social media, we need to be concerned about that. I don't mean necessarily concerned as in worried, but concerned as in interested and mindful of the due diligence we do on sourcing. I'm constantly telling my teenage son, where did that fact come from, or that information? What's the credibility of that source? He's studying history, and I studied history at university, and I think it's really relevant. What you learn in history is, everybody has a different opinion. It depends on your source material, and everyone is biased in their own way. But it makes it a lot easier when you understand what the bias is and where it's coming from.
Clearly, yeah, and that flows through to, our professional life as well. To try to steer back towards that direction. I think that background of really understanding and pursuing the facts and pursuing, kind of the sources and understanding what the angles are, critical fuel to any good content or communications marketing engine that we're going to build on, certainly B2B, as you point out in your book, but also just in our day-to-day existence as writers or as communicators. So you've gone a pretty long way with that in your career, starting as we just heard from journalism. And then you end up heading over to, there's a lot between, but there's a journey that goes through Australia and back to the UK. And in the end of it, there's formative content. So, how does one get there?
Well, I was I was basically a program editor. So I trained from the age of 25. I went to train at the BBC, and I very quickly realized I liked to be a program editor. I liked to not go out, and I loved finding the stories, but I didn't want to be out on the ground. I wanted to be kind of driving and telling the omnibus story. So that was what I wanted to do. I wanted to manage and run the team that then went out and gathered the stories every day. So, and then shape that into something that was really viewable and watchable. And that's what I absolutely loved to do. So I basically I was a studio producer for the evening news. So just like most countries, we have an evening news program. I was the live producer. I'd structure the program during the day, write it, then output it. And I did that in the UK for Channel 5 News. Then I went to Channel 4 News, and I became the managing editor there. So then I moved into management. I did an MBA part-time while I was doing the early shift at Channel 5 News. I recognized somewhere inside that I wanted to wanted to be a boss. I wanted to run something. But at that time, I didn't really understand what that meant. And I think I felt that having an MBA was some sort of shortcut to that. It wasn't. It did give me some skills in terms of understanding, in quite basic terms, how companies made money and how corporates are structured and how businesses run. So I was an output editor for quite a few years, and then I went to live with my family in Australia, which was a real diversion. It wasn't what I'd anticipated. I was a pretty senior news executive by then, but it was a really instructive move because it forced me to start again in a very, very different country where my experience wasn't necessarily as respected as it had been in the UK. I had to reinvent myself there, and I decided to reinvent myself effectively as a content expert. I'd seen what was going on with digital in the UK. I thought it was really interesting, the whole idea of narrative storytelling on digital platforms. It had started in the UK about that time, and I went and lived in Australia for 8 years. And in Australia, I know this is going to sound crazy, but I think it was easier, in inverted commas, to start a business. So I started first a consultancy, and I did individual consultancy using my kind of management consultancy experience and management experience coupled with the media work. And I started my own business producing content. So I did a lot of video content. I did mainly video content. It was a video production agency making high-end video content for companies like EY, KPMG. And it built my confidence. I think if I'd been at home in the UK, I think I might have been intimidated. intimidated by the market, intimidated by my experience of my track record as a news journalist. I didn't have any track record in making corporate video, and I had no one backing me. And it gave me an opportunity to create really great content with some brilliant professionals out there in a little bit of a smaller market. So it's a much smaller market in Sydney and in Melbourne, which is where I generally worked. And I did a lot of training, and I taught myself a whole load of stuff. And it was really, really great experience. And it showed me that I'd got maybe I shouldn't be saying this, but that I'd got the balls to do it.
Say whatever you want.
That I got the balls to do it, that I could do this, that I shouldn't, perhaps I'd been in a corporate job. I'd been in the BBC, which is a real institution in the UK. And I'd been then at ITN, which is smaller, a little bit more renegade. But going to Australia really forced me out of that comfort zone. And I think was a really, really beneficial part of my career. Incredible. I wouldn't have thought that at the time. At the time, I thought, oh my goodness, I'm surrendering the corporate vision and getting to the top, in inverted commas, of the news establishment. But actually, in retrospect, it was great. It was a great opportunity for me.
Well, how long did it take you to go from the point where you were saying, you know what, I think I need to reinvent myself, and then you start getting some clients till you feel like you have a viable business? You were there for 8 years.
I was there for 8 years, and for 18 months I worked for Hill and Knowlton, which is a PR agency, as their head of digital, and that was a woman called Michelle Hutton who recruited me just after I had my second baby. And when he was 16 weeks old, I went to work for her as her head of content. I was not great with babies. It was like, I need just actually to have a job and a focus. So I know that sounds kind of quite intense, but I only went back 2 days a week. But I just needed, for me, that was my mental health, opportunity to maintain my mental health. And I went to work with Michelle, who was a very forward-thinking, she still runs Edelman out, not she's recently gone back to Australia, and she recruited me to be her head of digital, and that was a real eye-opener for me because it taught me about agency life and so I was able then to understand and learn about agencies. So Hill and Knowlton was a PR agency, or is a PR agency, and it's now H&K Strategies. It's rebranded since then, but it was a really good opportunity for me to learn about client management, about how to engage with clients, about the way that I was more not more corporate, but I was more savvy about business there. You have to understand, how do you build a client? How do you offer service to a client? How the client's right, rather than I come from a journalism background where I say what goes and I'm going to put it out in the evening news, and if you don't agree with me, don't watch. So that was really...
It's a big flip.
It is. And I find a lot of journalists struggle with that when they come out of a newsroom and move into a corporate environment. It's actually saying you've got to understand you're in a very different world now. And you, whilst maintaining your integrity and your professionalism, you also have to recognise that there is a client who's paying you to achieve or deliver on something. So that was really extremely useful. And then I was, a couple of years after that, I worked as a consultant at the ABC there, and I restructured the news division. So I helped to restructure. I worked with the head of news there for 2 years, a woman called Kate Tawney. And I worked, first of all, for another consultancy, and then she asked me just to come on board to help implement the strategy I developed, and to help restructure the ABC newsroom at the time. So I did that 2 days a week whilst running the video production company as well. So that was about 2 or 3 years before we came back to the UK, and we came back here at the end of 2013. So I arrived back in the UK pretty much the start of 2014, get my feet under the table, settle the kids, get the house sorted, and started Formative in the spring of 2014.
So you're doing a variety of consulting roles and advisory positions in Australia for several years before you actually decided to, start your own, formalized company, as it were.
Yes, absolutely.
Right? Yeah. So you get back to the UK, and then 2014, did you start Formative right away, or was it?
It was a couple of months, and I'd met at that stage it was like, well, I wanted to start something, and I started to talk to people about different jobs here, different effectively freelance jobs that I might do. And then I was approached to pitch for a large piece of work, and I realised I needed other people with me. And at that stage, I remembered somebody that I'd met at the ABC in Sydney, an English chap called Paul, who I had spoken to just before he was returning. And coincidentally, he was living down the road from me. It turned out he was living down the road. So I rang him and I said, I've got this opportunity. Do you want to, are you interested in pitching with me? And Paul came on board. It was the May, June of 2014. And I'd got a couple of smaller clients, but nothing major. And then we got a large foundation client, which was the World Economic Forum. We pitched against two other agencies to take the job. It was just, at that time, it was creating one or two blogs. And we won that contract. And really, the rest, from my point of view, the rest is history. That person, Paul, is MD of Formative now. He's been my business partner ever since. And really, I couldn't have done what we'd done. We couldn't have built, we built this together, really.
Side note, shout out to Paul Mugridge. You may be a guest in the future on this podcast as well. Just warning you. That's all. Thank you very much. I'm familiar with Paul clearly. And I can't say enough to compliment the gentleman. But I wasn't really exactly aware of that's how you started the firm. And getting an anchor client like the World Economic Forum, and obviously you performed really well with them. That must have opened up a lot of doors.
It did, and it didn't initially, because we couldn't. They were a very discreet client, and at the time we had to be. We couldn't really promote around the work. We had to be very discreet and quiet about it, and so there was no chance that we could market around it. But so it was about then beating the long grass, and for me it was about leveraging my network. So I went and I talked to as many people that I could about what we were doing, and I followed a lot of leads, and I spoke to a lot of people, and I spoke to my friends, and ultimately I found that is how you build a company, and that is how you build a client base. Some of it was people spotting our content. So actually, interestingly, it was at MHI, it was Adrian, one of your colleagues, who spotted our name on a byline on the World Economic Forum content, which was one of the things that has really helped us. I think getting that shout out, that is definitely one thing that has over the years helped us build credibility. Because I think initially when you do build an organization or you do build an agency, it's about credibility. Nobody wants to hire somebody they don't think they can trust, and they always are very intrigued to hear, well, how many people have you got? How big are you? What can you do? Because they want to know that you can deliver and that you can deliver on what you say. And what we found is volume. The only way you can build a business model doing what we do, an agency world, is to build it with, it's an hours and materials culture, and with the whole overhead of the number of people that you need, you have to have a consistent flow of work. So for us, finding that flow of work has always been really, really important. And at the start, I took smaller client work. So alongside the forum work, I took a lot of smaller clients that were really not necessarily that they were great. Some of them were great to work with, but it was always a challenge, because with a smaller client, you're spending a lot more time trying to find out exactly what they want. And also, as an organization, we fit better into a larger marketing model where we can do one discrete thing. We do one discrete thing really well, which is we create incredibly good, high quality, tailored, deep content for B2B clients. And what I've found over the years, after the last 5 years, it's taken me a little while, is that only some clients are the correct clients. And I think this is about learning to run an agency. It's been really instructive.
That's pretty insightful, actually, because I've been on both sides. I've worked on the agency side, and I've had my own business in the past, and I 100% identify with the challenges that you've mentioned. And I was not wise enough back in, when I was 30, almost 20 years ago. Did I say that? Jeez. I'm dating myself, but I was all about, well, let me get this client and let me get that client, and I can do this and I can do that. And I too went through a process of reinvention once upon a time, or maybe several times upon a time, I don't know, but getting into the world of content creation, which at the time I didn't know that that's what I was doing. I just thought I was going to be a copywriter and be done with it. But it blew up into other things and led along different paths. But I didn't go down the road of building my own agency, so to speak. But that said, it's a real challenge. And something you said earlier about journalists and writers, essentially, authors, moving into the B2B space. I wanted to dig into that a little bit, because that's something I think that we're seeing more and more of. If you flash back or go back to our little touch on social media and how we have all these, quote unquote citizen journalists, and we have people who are just writing, and they don't realize that what they're doing is they're convincing and persuading people. The real journalists out there, the trained pursuers of truth and fact, who are getting cut out of their jobs, or who are, working thanklessly for an industry that is shrinking, the area of private industry certainly holds a lot of attraction, but it is the only road, I think, available for many to pursue their career as a journalist. But how do you pursue a career as a journalist working for a brand? And that is really, I think, where your book sets out this whole idea of brand journalism. We know that there are a lot of B2B companies for sure, but a lot of professionals who are in this content creation arena who talk about storytelling and talk about a newsroom. There's a lot, I think, customer to customer, client to client, industry to industry, that there's a lot of variation. There's no cookie cutter approach, right? But you've really been on the ground floor with a lot of this stuff, Gay, and you wrote a book about it. What are the elements of brand journalism? And can you talk about that a little bit? What is brand journalism? How does one flow from the world of journalism into brand journalism from the creation side of things, or from a corporate side? What should companies be looking for?
So there's two parallel tracks, which is one, how does a journalist migrate into the world of corporate writing, which I think is, we can come back to that, but I think if we're going to take brand journalism as a starting point, my shtick in the book is that we live in a world where generally we know that increasingly politicians are mistrusted, our governments are less trusted, we don't trust the establishment with a capital E, there's less trust in the media, and we've just talked about the demise in trust more broadly speaking, in social media as well. So I think for me, it was a sense of, and I saw it I recognized this some years ago, which was, you've got these fantastic channels. Why not use these as corporates and brands to own information and to deliver your own news? Now, I'm not saying you're going to break news like Channel 4. It's not about a independent journalism uncovering the injustices of the world. That's not what I'm talking about. But I am talking about brands being able to own some of the messaging that's out there and start to inform and educate. Why shouldn't they? A lot of brands, especially B2B brands, are highly expert in their arena that they work. It might be engineering, it might be tech services, it might be, it could be pharmaceuticals, whatever it is. They are exceptionally good at what they do, or they are very practiced at what they do. You might not agree with everything they do. And I think that is the issue for a lot of journalists is, I don't want to go and work for a corporate, the big corporate arm of a company that I believe is, only interested in profits. Now, but ultimately, I think still, if you're going to move into corporate journalism, as I would call it, you don't have to compromise all of your ethics. Ultimately, you're still talking about telling the truth, and it's the truth as they see it. I understand that. But everybody has a slanted view, whether they're a journalist on The Spectator, The New York Times, Fox News, whatever it is, everybody's coming from a particular position. So my view was, in a disintermediated world, and I'm going to use that horrible long word, but it is the perfect world to say we're in the perfect environment where we can own our channels, we can decide what messages we put on our channels, and we can take the cipher out. So I don't have to lean on a journalist or ask a journalist to publish my piece in the necessarily in this specialist paper. I might do that as part of the panoply of marketing activity that I do, but I don't have to rely on that. I can also contextualize that message with my own take on that piece. And that is effectively what brand journalism is. It's telling stories that align with your corporate values and your corporate message, and building storytelling around that and uncovering and surfacing the stories in your organization to corroborate and support what your key message is. So at the moment, there's a lot of talk about purpose. We are being encouraged we're being challenged by citizens to have purpose in what we do as corporates. But actually, the only way you're going to build a relationship of trust and build your brand as a corporate to be trusted and have a sense of purpose is to start telling stories around that and giving it evidence that supports it. And one of the ways you can do that is by employing journalists. So bringing journalists into your organization who then use their skills of surfacing stories, finding stories that resonate, telling stories and delivering stories. And that's why ideally you bring in a journalist to do that. You don't have to bring in an agency. Many companies don't have the budget to bring in agency. They might only be able to afford one person to surface stories. But it's still possible even with one person. So, but it's about finding somebody who will start to look in your organization to tell the narratives and surface the narratives that matter.
I see that happening, across the many B2B companies. Some do it right, some do it not so well. And, something you said earlier also about, some journalists, I suppose, or people coming over into the idea of writing or being brand journalists, so to speak, potentially worried about compromising their ethics or their standards for working for companies. I think, in this world now, I mean, I may be a little Pollyannish about this or over optimistic, but it seems to me that there is I'm not going to call it Darwinist, but there is certainly a natural kind of selection happening where some brands are certainly going to try and put forward a message or a story that is not true, or that is, that doesn't quite reflect the values that they are actually practicing, and they're going to get called out on it. So I'm not saying that a writer or a journalist who goes and works for a company is guaranteed to be to benefit from the fact that the company will have to ultimately tell the truth, but it seems that that sort of the whole industry is working towards that direction. I mean, I like to think that it is for sure.
Well, you can't be naive about it. If you are somebody who believes that all oil companies are bad, or that nobody will ever be redeemed, that the coal industry will never be redeemed, and if you cannot shift away from that, and your personal, your moral framework will not allow you to espouse any other views or those views, then you're going to find it very difficult to work, for instance, for an oil company, a large-scale engineering company, a major manufacturer. Because, but even financial services, I always say if you dig around with any company, if you really scratch every surface, if you look at every supply chain, it's very, very hard. I do believe that a lot of corporates do truly believe that if they are trying to do the right thing, but if you really don't believe you can, hand on heart, honestly do that work as a writer, you shouldn't move to the corporate side. It's like as a journalist, you're moving into PR, you're moving into corporate comms. You've got to be able to, hand on heart, say, well, I believe my clients. I want to work with these people. I mean, that's what I find. I find it exciting working with the clients we work with. Do we work with large-scale manufacturers? Yes. Do we work with low emissions technology companies, low emissions technology organizations that are looking into carbon capture? Yes, we do. Yes, does that involve coal? Yes, at one stage it did. But I think at some stage you've got to take corporates at face value, and you have got to help. You ultimately want to start telling them or help them tell their stories. But I don't think any journalist who wants to be bringing down the government should be working for see themselves working for a corporate. You'd be better off working for an truly independent, as you want to call it, news organization. We have interviewed people and where we said, look, theoretically, maybe, and we have been asked in the past to do this. I said, we might work for somebody who produces bottled water. How would you feel? This person had talked about their political views and said, well, how would you feel about working for somebody who produced plastics and writing a piece talking about how they were doing their best to kind of minimize plastic use? And they wouldn't want to do that. Well, it's again going back to the naivety or being honest with yourself. You're not that kind of a journalist is not going to want to work for me or work for us. That wouldn't be a good fit for them.
Yeah, and there's nothing wrong with that. And I would, in fact, it's you're probably doing yourself far more harm to go contra to your own values.
Totally, it's better
in your
to be
job.
Yeah,
you're not going to do the best job you possibly could. You'll harbor some resentment for any number of reasons. It's probably better to just work with companies and clients and customers that you can be comfortable with. I mean, that you can look at yourself in the mirror at night and say, I'm good with this.
And there's plenty of, in fact, I was approached, what are we, Tuesday? Friday of last week by a company that we wouldn't work with. And my team and I have decided we wouldn't work with that company. And I've had certainly at least a handful of other companies who've approached us who we would, at the time, would not work with. So it's also important, again, as a business owner, as an agency owner, to be really clear about what's acceptable and what isn't, and take that to your team and talk to your team about it. And if there is a grey area, go to your team, talk to them, but ultimately as well, I have a responsibility to keep my employees employed. So
Sure.
I also need to bring work in. And so sometimes it grieves me when I know that I'm going to have to say no to an approach. But I am, you do also have to draw the line.
Yeah. And these days, probably more than ever, employees, they're more of our partners. They're more of our colleagues, counterparts, whatever you want to call them, us. There are certainly some cultures in the world where the employee-employer relationship is extremely hierarchical, and you sign on for life, and you keep your head down, and you're in the new army, and whatever it is that the orders that you get, you do. But I think, and certainly from my experience, I see that changing. Not as acceptable as it may have been in the past, and some companies that are multinational, global organizations have certain countries within their portfolio that are that way, and certain that are more flat, and certain that where the employees are extremely empowered. I would think that in the area of content creation, we're dealing with people who are fairly mobile. These are skills. A good writer can write anywhere. A good designer can design anywhere. You want to keep them, or they should be working for places that align with their own values, and will give them the contentment that we all deserve. But we as employers, or we as customers or clients, we should be cognizant of the fact that, people can go anywhere, yet they're choosing to work with us.
I mean, I have got a fantastic team. The business, it rises and falls on your team. And as a small business owner, it's crucial, especially doing something like we do, which is these refined product in specialist areas, niche verticals. It's really important that you have the craft skills. I was really interested to see today, actually, that there was a piece in The Guardian in the UK that had been written by a machine, so AI-driven output. And I do think that will become part of the range of output that is out there. And I do think it has a place. Just like it did in TV. In TV world, you used to have editors cutting sophisticated packages. Gradually, journalists started doing it, and then it becomes a hybrid. And I do believe it's a continuum. Your base level content, there's certain pieces of content and articles that will, I think, start to devolve to the machine in the long term. But I think there will also be a space for craft. And what I've got is a mixture, I hope, built a mixture of data and process coupled with skill and craft. And that for me is the magic mix, is highly expert writers. And I know from the way that we engage with our clients that that's appreciated, the nuance of what we write, coupled with the speed and efficiency of a newsroom, just to go back to that brand journalism piece, which is just the ethos of what we espouse. And I think that really works in a business. I think, again, it comes back to, I think you just talked about this idea of teams and partners. It's highly, highly important that you have great people, especially in a small business, because a small business, you're very exposed. Everybody is very exposed. You can't carry people if you only have a very small number of people. And I think that's one of the things that I have learnt about running a small business as well, just how intense it is and how important it is that you get the right people, because you know very quickly when you haven't got the right people. And so the first senior manager we recruited was a head of people, interestingly. Because Paul and I think, recognised very early on how important it was, as we're getting bigger, that we had someone who helped with that.
When you're fundamentally, in an industry that is charged with relating to audiences, I think it's really important to get people who can relate to audiences. Fundamentally, you need to have people that you can get along with, but you also have to have people that share the values and certainly have the talent and skill to do what you're doing. Something you said also reminded me of this whole idea that, we think about content these days, and we think about, marketing and so on. And you think of an article, you think of a podcast, or you think of, a video, and different media get popular at different times, or different media are certainly appropriate to certain channels that are not appropriate to other channels. I mean, this is the bread and butter of basically our existence here, is knowing or having a fundamental understanding based on data, based on, the experience that we've witnessed and the evidence that we see, that certain types of content will work on certain types of channels to reach certain types of people at certain particular times, to achieve a certain kind of result. And, understanding that it is not just a matter of understanding a topic and writing about it, but it's actually the whole ecosystem. It's this whole ecosystem that goes all the way straight to the employee, the writer, the editor, the client, the audience. All of these pieces are part of a whole larger integrated, I guess we got to call it systems thinking in some ways, right? And that ecosystem is what really, I think it's really almost endlessly exciting, because you can dive into any part of it, change the whole thing, make it better, make it totally worse. You can easily flip a switch and make everything go boom. But what I hear a lot these days is, what's the experience? What's the content experience? You hear about customer experience, digital experience, employee experience, something X, CX, DX, EX, whatever. What's your view, on this idea that we are now experiential marketers, or thinking about an experiential system?
Well, I think ultimately always the most important thing or person you've got to think of always is the audience, is the end user, as you want to, whatever name you give to that. So it's because how is a brand going to land with a person? It's how the sales executive picks up the phone. It's the blog that you read. It's the image that you see. All of that builds up to be the brand reputation. And so and that front end is hugely important at building a reputation for who you are as an organization. And it's also woven into experience. So I do think that traditional user experience, sales experience has kind of melded together with content, because so much of the experience of an end user is delivered in content terms. So it could be a social media piece, it could be an article, a video. And so I do think if the content experience is, how does the user feel, I think that's more relevant than it's ever been. But I always say, one of the hackneyed phrases that people in my organization are sick of hearing is, what does this content make you think, feel, and do? Which is a classic kind of comms narrative. I don't know whether you ever kind of heard. It's like, that's where I start every single conversation with my guys and with the clients, which is, okay, you've asked us to do, quite often a client will come, we want to do this, fill in the gap blog. Hold on, let's unpick this. What do you actually want to achieve? And then let's talk about what you should be doing. And then maybe we could talk about, should that be an Insta story on a carousel? Because actually you're trying to approach, you're trying to engage new recruits or something. I don't know, or should that be a short form social video? Because we know it's just actually about attracting attention to something and then trying to encourage people into the experience of your website or into the experience of your content. And ultimately, you're trying to make them travel always further down the funnel. In B2B terms, we're always talking. We know, you know this because your sales conversion period is huge. But generally, I'm working with clients where the conversion funnel is around 18 months to 2 years quite often, and where it could be, the client there could be 12 clients, like a handful. You're not talking about thousands of people. You're talking about a very narrow niche of people that you've got to really build a relationship with. And the only way you're going to do that is if you really understand what makes them tick. And that is down to, what do they enjoy reading? What are they reading? What is the data around what they're sharing? And that's where I think that's what's endlessly fascinating about what we do, is it's changing all the time. It's challenging us all the time. We have to rethink things. That platform's disappeared. That one's emerged. That format's disappeared. That one doesn't work anymore. And, and I think, and then you come back to, well, actually something that you thought was quite basic, sometimes that can work really well. So don't over-engineer things sometimes. And that's what I love, is trying to unpick and find what's the right solution for the client. It's not necessarily the busy, whizzy new thing. It could be something surprising that is actually quite accessible to them.
The bits and pieces are always changing, like you said, right?
Totally.
One thing I'm hearing a lot, or kind of sensing maybe in a lot of my conversations, is this idea of appropriateness. Like, when is something appropriate or not? And I think a lot of brands, I know a lot of brands struggle with this idea that they can be talking about things without actually branding themselves. And there are times when it is appropriate to be speaking about your brand, and there are times when it's not. And generally speaking, in a long sales cycle, when you've got anywhere from 1 to 5 to 10 years potentially, getting in front of somebody when they're not even ready to think about you and slamming home the fact that you've got a specific marker may work against you in the long run.
So that I talk about that in the book, because this is what it's called. It's pre-sales funnel. It's before you even know that you want to buy, and it's about trying to demonstrate that your brand has resonance and relevance for somebody. So this is all about the culture and the ether of our discussions. And I think this is a shift that we've seen over recent years, and I think even more during COVID and during this period, which is it's circling back to purpose. Is this a brand does this brand share my ethos? Is this a brand I can relate to? Do I feel an affiliation for this brand? Now, that doesn't mean I want to hear about your product. I don't need to hear about your product. I want to hear about what you feel about equality. I want to understand that you treat your people well. I want to understand that you interrogate your supply chain and that you do right by communities around the world. So and that's where I think we as brands, and I call it earning the right. You earn the right to talk about certain aspects of the world in which you live in. If you employ thousands of people around the world, my view is you earn the right to talk about labor laws. You earn the right to talk about equality in the workplace, and you actually have a responsibility to step up and tell people what you feel about those things. So I think that appropriateness is much broader than just talking about what you do as a brand. And I hear this quite a lot from some clients. It's not so much the clients that we're working with, because I feel our client base is very educated when it comes to marketing and comms. But sometimes companies cannot resist I just want to whack my brand out there and tell them how good my product is. And it's like, you know what? You need the TLC before that. You need to build a relationship. You need to have the first dance before you go for the dinner stage.
I love that. The first dance before you go for the dinner, I mean, to bring it almost back to where we started, that's almost like the difference between doing a radio spot and doing thought leadership. I mean, a radio spot is get the brand in the mind, quickly associate it with a story, and, have people remember that the toll-free phone number that goes with it, and speak very fast. That is the opposite end of, although an element of storytelling in a 30-second spot takes unbelievable skill, I think. It's the opposite end of building a relationship.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of my clients, quite a long time ago now, said, we want license to operate. We want to be brought into the room to pitch for business. And sometimes for less well-known brands, that is what you're trying to help them do. And, a lot of these companies are there are lots of very well-known companies that are extremely good at what they do, but who might not get put on a tender list. And they have incredible insights, and they want to tell their stories and find different ways to engage and different ways to connect with people, and actually uncovering and surfacing what they do and what they believe. Culturally, actually can be difficult for some companies. In Europe, maybe it's a little easier. Other countries, as I think you said, in some companies there is definitely a tradition of being a little more structured or organized about how you pitch and market yourselves. But this is a much gentler. It's a relationship building piece, which is different. It's a different challenge.
People never saw that the idea of talking about your company or the things that you do, the purpose is to build a relationship. The purpose was always to sell, right? I mean, in the legacy mind, what are we selling from this? Now, we all as corporate animals, as people who belong to corporations or who work for a corporation, we ultimately are responsible for driving at some point to a positive effect on the balance sheet, in some way or another.
Totally.
And, and the way that's measured varies, and there's a lot of sophistication in that. But at least from the point of view of brand journalism or of this whole idea of reputation building has come under the remit of the marketer now and of the communicator, the marketing communications people. The line is very blurry, but getting out there at the top of the traditional funnel, but just generally speaking, the beginning of the experience, the beginning of the relationship, and building that reputation is now the domain of content marketers and content creators. And it's it's a very important place to be. I think it's incredibly important.
And I think it's fascinating. I mean, I love what I do, so it's great to be in it, and it's really exciting and challenging. And the more complicated the sales process and the product, the better. I do think ultimately, though, and for me as an agency owner, I've always got to be demonstrating ROI. So I think I learned that very early on when a couple of times, I think I was quite, I was naive when I started the business. You go and pitch something, and as a journalist, you think, well, it's a great story, and you should be interested in that. It's like, well, why am I going to spend X thousand pounds on this? What is going to come out the other end? And I think that's something I've got much better at in terms of my learnings, which is I always want to demonstrate that there's an end game and an output. It may well be brand and reputation, so less, a little bit more difficult to discern. But ideally, it's, the client wants to sell things. Let's not, ultimately we're in, it's a business. These companies are businesses, and ultimately they're selling something. So yes, I'm building relationships, but ultimately the end of the journey is hopefully a relationship built to the point where there is an opportunity to sell. And I don't think you can be naive about that. I'm communicating for the purpose of building the reputations of the brands that I'm working with.
And any brand is obviously concerned about making sure that whatever investment they make in content, in their reputation, does ultimately accrue to something in the pockets of the shareholders or in their own pockets or wherever it is. And there's nothing wrong with that. So we've talked about the whole content ecosystem. We've talked about reputation. We've talked about your book a little bit. I wish we could have gotten into it a little bit more. But here it is. What do you see coming down the pike? I mean, what is the future of content experience, of content marketing, according to you, and formative content?
Obviously, I don't have a crystal ball. Marketeers and analysts have been saying for a long time we're going to get much more data-led, and I think that is absolutely a certainty. I think we're going to get much more refined in terms of judging what's successful in terms of our content, because at the moment, I still think I know from our experience, it's quite hard to unpick quite often how content is impacting, and I think that will become more straightforward. I hope it will. I hope we will get more technologies. I think that there will be more pressure on brands to be the information deliverers. So, as I said before, that younger people and generally individuals will start to look to brands, and the brands that can step into that space will get huge opportunity. And that increasingly we will see a much broader set of assets that we can use and formats that we can use to deliver the message. I think there will be ever more shift to video, which we've been seeing, we've been saying for many years, but we're definitely seeing it now, and I'm feeling it now, i.e. more clients are coming to me for video, which has not traditionally happened, i.e. people were saying, oh yeah, video is going to take off, but I wasn't really feeling that. Definitely I'm feeling that more now, which I think is going to prove to be a real shift. And I think there will be more pressure, as I said, on organizations. I think for the next year to 2 years is going to be this shift to purpose. Put your money where your mouth is, brands. Demonstrate what you're doing for humanity and society, your credentials. Demonstrate those credentials to me. Show me.
I think that's going to go across the boards to almost everybody who has any hope of dealing with other people. If you're in a relationship business, if you're making connections, if you're doing anything, you have to, I suppose, show that you are a purpose-driven being in some ways.
Yeah, that you care. There's an empathy. We build, so much. I think COVID's been fascinating in terms of how it's changed the dynamics of relationships and the intimacy that you can feel now in a way that maybe you didn't before. I definitely feel that. And I sense that that's what we're going to feel like there will be a shift in how we feel towards the brands or generally, and people we are engaging with.
I think it's got to happen too. So, Gay Flashman, this has been a pleasure. There's one last thing that I would like to ask you, and that is there a question that I didn't ask you that you would like to answer?
No, we haven't talked about COVID and how COVID has impacted everybody and everything. And I think it will cause a shift in pressure on organizations to engage more carefully in terms of their comms. And as I've said, to get more intimate and to be more open. And I think some organizations will find that really challenging. But I think the ones that do it effectively and can maintain these relationships will do very well from it.
And that is a great way to wrap this up. I think there's a lot more that we can talk about for sure. And I would love to reserve the right to invite you back again to have more of a conversation, because we've only scratched the surface of your tremendous book. I have a whole bunch of notes here that I didn't even get to. We did cover quite a bit of it in the midst of our conversations, but look, I encourage anybody who is listening today to go to Amazon, pick up Powerful B2B Content by Gay Flashman. That's Flashman, Gay Flashman. She's tremendous. She's here with me. She is a killer writer, and obviously she has her own company called Formative Content, and that is spelled exactly the way it sounds, formativecontent.com, and based in the UK. Please check them out. Go on LinkedIn, look at Gay Flashman to find out more about Gay and what she does. Gay, Paul Mugridge, the whole Formative team, these are people that you want to work with, trust me. And you definitely want to read Powerful B2B Content. So on that note, I thank you very much, Gay, for your time. Thank you for coming.
Thanks, Dan. It's been a pleasure. Thanks so much.
Awesome. If you enjoyed this episode of The Dan Nessel Show, please head on over to iTunes, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or the podcast player of your choice to subscribe, rate, and leave a review. And please don't forget to spread the word. Thanks for listening.